international trade. The aim of today's forum is to hear about Brunei's economic priorities as chair of ASEAN 2021, hear about how the UK can partner ASEAN, and discuss the economic and geopolitical outlook for Southeast Asia for the year ahead. It is our pleasure to have with us today the Honourable Dato Dr. Haji Muhammad Amin Liu bin Abdullah, Minister at the Prime Minister's Office and Minister of Finance and Economy II of Brunei Darussalam, and the Right Honourable Greg Hands, MP, Minister of State for Trade Policy at the Department for International Trade. We are delighted to have Baroness Neville Rolfe, Chair of the UK-ASEAN Business Council, to lead the discussion, and His Excellency, First Admiral, retired Pengiran Dato Norazmi bin Pengiran Haji Muhammad, High Commissioner of Brunei Darussalam to the United Kingdom, to deliver welcome remarks, along with a stellar cast of speakers today, including Dr. Deborah Elms, Executive Director of the Asia Trade Centre in Singapore, Mark Garnier, Member of Parliament and Prime Minister's Trade Envoy to Brunei, Myanmar and Thailand, zooming in from the UK, Dr. Rizal Sukma, Senior Researcher at the Centre for Strategic and International Studies, and former Indonesian Ambassador to the UK, now in Jakarta, and Joseph Inkalkatra, Chief Economist for ASEAN for HSBC based in Hong Kong. I'm Alan Lai with the UK-ASEAN Business Council in Brunei and have a couple of notes to highlight before we begin. Firstly, we would love to hear your thoughts and questions and invite you to post your comments in the question box at the bottom of your screen, and our chair will pass them on to the panel. Secondly, do tag us in your social media posts at UK-ASEAN and at ASEAN_BAC. And the official Brunei Twitter handle is at ASEAN2021_BN. And now, to deliver her welcome remarks and to chair the first session, I would like to hand over to the chair of the UK-ASEAN Business Council. Baroness Neville Rolfe has had 3 careers in politics, in business, and in the civil service. A former UK business minister and board director for Tesco, Baroness Neville Rolfe is now an active peer in the House of Lords and has tremendous experience with and a passion for Southeast Asia. Baroness Neville Rolfe, over to you in London.
Alan, thank you so much. And it is a particular pleasure to be starting the year by co-hosting this important event with the ASEAN Business Advisory Council, where it's morning in London, the sun is just coming up, an afternoon in Brunei, and the UK, that's the ASEAN, and they will be joining us shortly. The UK-ASEAN Business Council, which I have the pleasure to chair, champions British business across Southeast Asia and works with ASEAN member states, highlighting trade and investment opportunities to UK companies, some of whom sit on our board. And we work with those companies, such as Prudential and Shell and AstraZeneca, who, by the way, will be manufacturing COVID vaccine in the region, to develop existing investments and encourage new ones. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from the Brunei Chair about the priorities for the year that will shape the ASEAN region with its huge growth opportunities. I'd like to introduce my friend, the Brunei High Commissioner to the UK. We're delighted that His Excellency Pengiran Dato Norazmi, sorry if I've got that wrong, High Commissioner, but High Commissioner in the UK, he is with us, and perhaps he would like to give a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Baroness. Baroness Lucy, Yang Berhormat Dato, Excellencies, Ministers, distinguished guests, speakers, ladies and gentlemen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and very good morning. Before I start, I would like to wish everyone here a Happy New Year, and I hope that this year will be a safer and prosperous year for all of us. Indeed, I was honored to have received an invitation to take part in this forum. And once again, I wish to thank the Baroness and her team for the invite. Brunei Darussalam is delighted to be the ASEAN Chair for this year. This is the 5th time that we have chaired ASEAN. At the same time, we certainly welcome the UK's application to become a dialogue partner. And as ASEAN Chair, we will continue to work on the UK's application. A future dialogue partner with UK has a lot to offer to ASEAN, such as building on two-way trade and economic engagements, and learn from the UK expertise in digital and technology fields, especially in view of ASEAN's work on a consolidated strategy on the fourth industrial revolution. ASEAN can also benefit from the UK expertise in the medical field that will help boost regional health cooperation and to be better prepared in any future pandemic outbreaks. We also welcome UK generous contribution to COVID-19 ASEAN Response Fund. Overall, we believe there is a great potential for ASEAN-UK partnership to be mutually beneficial by upholding multilateralism, supporting ASEAN-led regional architecture, and contributing to peaceful, stable, and prosperous region. Just to share, as previous chair of ASEAN London Committee, ALC, we have engaged and helped organize briefings and with several key departments, organizations, and businesses in the UK as an opportunity to promote UK expertise to ASEAN in the field of education, technical and vocational education and training, TVET, skills, and green tech. I recall the most recent one we had was a fruitful session between the ALC and the UK-ABC on the emphasis on green tech. The session was joined by Shell and Wood, both leading UK companies who have a strong presence in Brunei, to share their plans on how to deliver a lower carbon energy feature for ASEAN. On this note, we can largely benefit and learn from the UK leading expertise in green tech, the development of green technology, climate change response, and sustainable development, since sustainability is certainly both a priority and a deliverable for both countries respectively under Brunei ASEAN Chairmanship and the UK Chairmanship of COP26 this year. I hope with today's session, we can attract more UK businesses to invest in the region to help strengthen our trade and investment link, while at the same time also helping Brunei Darussalam achieve its key economic deliverables as ASEAN Chair. On my final note, for UK businesses present during this forum, we at the High Commission are ready to help you with any assistance you require, and please feel free to contact us anytime. Thank you, Baroness.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner. And if I could, I'd like to introduce the Honourable Yanti Raman, who's chair of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council 2021, and our partners today with this session. I'm delighted to be working with you again, Yanti. You're a member of Brunei's Legislative Council, a British trained architect, and of course, CEO of the architect firm, Echo Bumi Architect, founded by you. Perhaps you could very briefly give a welcome so that we can move swiftly on to the Minister because we are time constrained. But thank you so much for coming, Yanti.
Thank you so much, Baroness Lucy, Chairwoman of UK-ASEAN Business Council. Honorable Datu Seri Setia Dr. Amin Liu bin Abdullah, Minister in the Prime Minister's Office and Second Minister of Finance and Economy, His Excellency Vice Admiral Pangeran Datuk Norazmi bin Pangeran Haji Muhammad, High Commissioner of Brunei Darussalam to UK. The Right Honourable Greg Hans, Member of Parliament, Minister of State for Trade Policy in the Department of International Trade, and Mr. Mark Garnier, Member of Parliament and Prime Minister's Trade Envoy to Brunei, Myanmar and Thailand. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning and thank you everyone for joining our forum today, and I hope all of you are doing great. Welcome to our UK-ASEAN Business Council Forum on Brunei's Chairmanship of ASEAN 2021. It is a great honor to be here among all of you this morning to share our wisdom and inspirations in strengthening our UK-ASEAN relationship through our platform today. As the chair of ASEAN Business Advisory Council 2021, Brunei is tireless and truly have faith in this great opportunity and responsibility to continue advocating the needs of business in ASEAN throughout this challenging year. The Asian Development Bank has forecasted regional growth to be about 5.2% across the region, but the growth will be imbalanced, with some ASEAN member states doing well and the others still hampered by the impact of COVID-19. Now, Brunei's theme for this year is "We care, we prepare, we prosper." Focuses the need for inclusivity and collaboration to ensure that ASEAN is capable to thrive again. Now, I would like to share our ASEAN Business Advisory Council 2021 theme, which is Recover Stronger, Together, Sama-sama, which personifies and further strengthens our efforts in all fundamental areas. We recover, we are stronger, we are together, sama-sama. As we recover to be stronger, together we shall signify our voices as one community who are more connected, robust, and integrated as we move together to achieve our goals. Now we care, we prepare, we prosper, sama-sama, towards one vision, one identity, one community. We move together towards our future. We are indeed the ASEAN legacy. In view of legacy projects by ASEAN Business Advisory Council, Brunei's Harnessing Impact for Resilient Employability Digitally, or HIRED, H-I-R-E-D, is a project which intends to address skills gaps in ASEAN and bridging skills within the region, while staying relevant by building a proper ecosystem in empowering ASEAN to meet the balance in supply and demand in workforce. Now, ASEAN workforce needs to have the precise skills for a digital age to help the business community recover. Now, we welcome the UK government in their efforts to further develop its digital partnership with ASEAN through the UK-ASEAN Digital Business Challenge, a pilot project which will explore how tech, micro, small, and medium enterprises can provide digital solutions to some of the businesses that face issues in ASEAN. Now, one of ASEAN Bank's priority area is sustainability, which is in line with the ASEAN priority economic deliverables for our chairmanship 2021. In achieving our desired outcomes, we will actively engage more in providing our inputs for the finalization of ASEAN Circular Economy Framework. This will be one of our key milestones in enhancing ASEAN's economic landscape. Tapping into green infrastructure sustainability, I believe that more sustainable infrastructure for growth in ASEAN are needed due to existing economic climate, which poses an opportunity to collaborate with the UK to build a greener and more sustainable global economy. We're also happy to know that the UK offered. Thank you. So I will just end with this. ASEAN Bank look forward to collaborating with the ASEAN ministers and all shareholders in future. Thank you and look forward for a productive session ahead. Baroness Lucy, thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Yanti Rahman. And we now move on to our keynote address. And thank you, Dr. Dato Aman, for being here. Dr. Dato Aman is, of course, chair of both the ASEAN Finance and ASEAN Trade Ministers meeting in 2021. So incredibly important for the future of ASEAN. I had the pleasure of meeting you in London in 2019, and it's great to see you again. Only sorry that it all has to be online, and we look forward to your keynote address. Minister, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Your Right Honourable Greg Hands, Minister of State for Trade Policy, Your Excellency Mark Garnier, the Prime Minister's Trade Envoy, Your Excellency First Admiral Pangeran Datuk Sri Pahlawan Norazmi bin Pangeran Haji Mohamad, High Commissioner of Brunei Darussalam to the United Kingdom, Your Excellency Baroness Neville Roth, Chair of the UK-ASEAN Business Council, Mr. Ian Gibbons, Chief Executive of the UK-ASEAN Business Council, the Honorable Rosaim Mariuyanti Rahman, Chair of the ASEAN Business Advisory Council and member of the Legislative Council of Brunei Darussalam, UK-ABC delegations, ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good afternoon. It is good to see you all. I thank you for the honor of inviting me to deliver a keynote address at this important event. It is unfortunate, as Baroness just mentioned, that we couldn't convene this physical meeting, but I'm glad to be able to join all of you virtually today. The fact that this is possible, there is no denying that technology plays a central role in this new norm. Your Right Honorable Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, 2020 will be remembered as a year dominated by a global coronavirus pandemic, an unprecedented year, a global health crisis like no other, a wake-up call for us, a call for concerted and collaborative efforts in fighting against the COVID-19 pandemic, a call for multilateralism. The outbreak of the virus has triggered an economic crisis worldwide, and the ASEAN region is no exception. It has severely disrupted the region's supply chains, which have led to shortages of essential goods, such as food and medical supplies. The pandemic has disrupted economic activities such as declining tourism flows, disruption in travel and supply chains connectivity, thus affecting the manufacturing sector and international trade. All these have had dramatic consequences on people's life and livelihoods across the ASEAN region. Given the extensive impacts of the pandemic, many countries, including ASEAN member states, are focusing on recovery efforts to improve their economies and the livelihoods of their people, while intensifying their efforts to contain the spread of the COVID-19 virus. The effects of the pandemic are likely to have significant long-term impacts. Regional responses will be the key to recovery as countries attempt to reopen their borders to movement of people and reinvigorate global supply chains. The pandemic has heightened ASEAN's collective efforts towards strengthening the region's economic resilience by ensuring open and connected supply chains, as well as increasing intra-ASEAN trade and investment. One such effort is the adoption of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its implementation plan by the ASEAN leaders during the 37th ASEAN Summit held in November 2020, with the intention of addressing the region's needs in transiting to the new normal, as well as advancing to a more sustainable and resilient future in the long term. Indeed, it is also heartening to see that the region's initiatives are geared towards turning this adversity into opportunities. We see this current crisis as an opportunity for a change in thinking to an approach that addresses shortcomings and seeks to provide a better future for the next generation. Therefore, 2021 will be the year where ASEAN as a region intensifies our efforts towards building an ASEAN community that is inclusive, sustainable, resilient, and dynamic. We believe that no one is and should be left behind in ASEAN recovery. No doubt, the pandemic has changed how the world functions. It has definitely hastened digitalization in the region. Thus, it is important for ASEAN to safeguard the security of the region by enhancing cybersecurity capabilities, while also being cognizant of new and emerging technologies. Additionally, ASEAN must continue to demonstrate its resolute support and commitment for multilateralism. It is against this backdrop that the proposed priority economic deliverables, or PEDs, for our ASEAN chairmanship are formulated. Number one, the focus on economic recovery efforts in the region. Number two, the importance of strengthening ASEAN's resilience in the context of the unprecedented and changing landscapes. Number three, to prepare ASEAN for future opportunities and challenges. Hence, the proposed PEDs are categorized into three strategic thrusts. Number one, recovery, progressing together towards the region's economic recovery. Number two, digitalization, leveraging on new technologies and digitalization for a resilient ASEAN. And number three, sustainability, in pursuit of advancing an inclusive and sustainable economic growth in ASEAN. Allow me to elaborate on each of the proposed PEDs. Under the strategic thrust recovery, there are four proposed PEDs. First is to conduct a comprehensive assessment to streamline NTMs, which includes the development of an NTMs toolkit, which can be used to review NTMs in terms of compliance, enforcement, and design. Second PED is to develop a recovery plan for ASEAN tourism, one of the most impacted sectors by the pandemic. This plan will help to provide comprehensive and coordinated solutions to enhance sustainability, resilience, and social inclusiveness in ASEAN tourism industry during and post-pandemic. The third PED we aim to achieve this year is to launch the negotiation for a possible ASEAN-Canada FTA. The foundation of this FTA has been laid out, and we believe it is timely to launch this FTA. The fourth PED under this trust, or the last PED under this trust, is to develop the ASEAN Investment Facilitation Framework, which will facilitate investment into the region and prepare for the post-COVID-19 new norm. Furthermore, it would help to integrate ASEAN into global value chains and contribute to ASEAN's comprehensive recovery effort. Under the second strategic thrust, digitalization, we have two PEDs. That is the fifth and the sixth. The fifth PED aims to develop a work plan to implement the ASEAN Agreement on Electronic Commerce. This work plan will guide member states on how to advance the effective implementation of the ASEAN Agreement on e-commerce over the next 5 years, both at regional and national level. The next PED is developing a regional action plan to implement each of the 11 voluntary norms of responsible states behavior in cyberspace recommended by the 2015 UNGGE report. This will help the region in implementing the cyber norms and cooperation activities to develop the required capabilities. The third strategic thrust, sustainability. Under this, there are 4 PEDs, which is the 7, 8, 9, and 10. So the 7th PED is developing an ASEAN framework, which will support food, agriculture, and forestry, small producers, cooperatives, and MSMEs that have been severely impacted by the pandemic. This deliverable aims to improve their product standards and raise their competitiveness. The 8th PED focuses on energy, and that is to develop an ASEAN joint declaration on energy transitions and energy security. This is expected to set out ways for ASEAN to cooperate in the pursuit of energy transitions and energy security. This is the 9th PED, a new concept for the region, and therefore it is important to identify at this early stage the key areas of circular economy which are of relevance to the work of the AEC, drawing upon global and regional best practices. Last but not least, the 10th PED, Brunei Darussalam aims to deliver key recommendations to advance ASEAN cooperation in mineral resource development in light of opportunities arising from global trend and shifts in the global minerals and metals markets. This PED will contribute to the Sustainable Community Development Goals of the AEC Blueprint 2025. Brunei Darussalam has been working closely with the ASEAN Secretariat in developing these PEDs, and we believe it is timely. Vietnam, as the previous ASEAN Chair, has paved the way for economic recovery, and it is important that we continue this positive momentum. It is our hope to lead ASEAN in the economic revitalization and recovery efforts, including advancing digital capabilities of our people to adapt to the new digital environment amidst the pandemic, so as to boost the sustainability of our economy. ASEAN also recognizes the important role the private sector plays in our economic integration agenda. The experience and expertise of the private sector in the utilization of technology and innovation will be invaluable in our post-pandemic recovery efforts, including digital transformation, to ensure that the shift towards a digital era are all inclusive. This will solidify ASEAN commitments to protect people's lives and livelihoods, maintain socio-economic stability, while also sustaining ASEAN community building momentum for sustainable development and inclusive growth. In this regard, Brunei Darussalam look forward to active engagement with the business councils, including UKABC, in providing feedbacks and inputs to our ASEAN chairmanship deliverables and the continuous support during our chairmanship year. So I thank you very much.
Dr. Dr. Armin, thank you so much for that thoughtful and forward-looking agenda. Perhaps I could just ask you briefly how you think the UK business community might contribute to the achievement of those 10 goals.
Yeah, and I think Brunei Darussalam very much welcomes UK's support across all these 3 strategic thrusts that I have just shared. Of course, you know, we always recognize UK's strengths in technology and sustainability. I believe this would be particularly relevant and beneficial for ASEAN. So I think especially this year when UK will be hosting COP26, there may be some overlapping of goals that we could mutually benefit from each other. So we very much look forward to the assistance from UK in supporting Brunei's chairmanship this year.
Indeed. Well, thank you so much. And we look forward to supporting you on your deliverables. And if I might now turn now back to London to the Right Hon. Greg Hands MP, who's Minister of State for Trade Policy at our Department for International Trade, and indeed has been the Minister of State most of the time since 2016. He's also, importantly, the ministerial lead for the ASEAN economic community in the UK. Minister Hands, over to you for your keynote address.
Well, good morning here in London, and good afternoon in Brunei and the wider ASEAN region. Dato, thank you for your excellent address, and many congratulations on Brunei on assuming the 2021 chairmanship of ASEAN. And thank you to you, Baroness Rolfe, the High Commissioners, the Right Honourable Yanti Raman, and everybody else, and including Mark Garnier, our Prime Minister's trade envoy to Brunei and elsewhere in the region too, for joining us this morning. So my thanks also to UK-ASEAN Business Council and the ASEAN Business Advisory Council for organising this event. This is an opportunity both to understand Brunei's priorities for its ASEAN chairmanship and explore opportunities for greater UK-ASEAN economic cooperation. As the UK's ministerial lead, as you rightly say, Lucy, for the ASEAN Economic Community, I've followed the development of Brunei's priorities for its chairmanship of ASEAN with great interest. The message, we care, we prepare, we prosper, resonates strongly here in the UK as well. And as we begin to emerge from the devastating impact of COVID-19, recovery, digitalization, and sustainability are already referred to by Dato are key objectives for us. And we continue to work together on a number of shared interests in these areas. Digital, for example, is a top priority for the UK, and I'm delighted that we will engage with ASEAN on this through our UK-ASEAN Digital Innovation Partnership. This follows last year's launch of the Digital Trade Network and UK Southeast Asia FinTech series aimed at supporting increased digital innovation in ASEAN. It is also striking to see how the themes for your ASEAN chairmanship chime, as you've already mentioned, with our areas of focus for COP26, which we'll host in Glasgow in November, and for our presidency of the G7 as well. Together, I'm confident that we can deliver our shared ambition of resilient, inclusive, and clean growth for ASEAN and the UK, including implementation of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and the AEC midterm review. I would like to begin by outlining the UK's broader trade policy. As a newly independent trading nation, the UK intends to seize the chance to embrace the opportunities of a wider world. In under 2 years, we have agreed trade deals with 63 countries, plus the European Union, accounting for £885 billion of UK bilateral trade, more than $1 trillion US. Our overall aims are to secure free trade agreements with countries covering 80% of UK trade within the next 3 years, to champion the multilateral rules-based system, and to use our voice to advocate reform of the WTO to ensure it is forward-looking, empowered, and fit to tackle the 21st century challenges. We look forward to working with ASEAN to progress these matters ahead of the 12th WTO Ministerial Conference. And I'm delighted to say that the UK global tariff, which came into effect on the 1st of January, just under 3 weeks ago, which is, we inherited the EU's common external tariff, but we've turned it into a specific UK system of tariffs. We lowered tariffs, we simplified them, and we've made them greener as well, and scrapped red tape and lower tariffs relative, as I said, to the EU's common external tariff, making trade cheaper and easier and benefiting businesses and consumers in UK and ASEAN alike. ASEAN, of course, has always been an important partner for the UK. Our two-way trade has increased by 50% over the last decade to over £40 billion. And even during the pandemic, UK exports to ASEAN have defied global trends, growing by 10% year on year. There is clearly tremendous potential in our future relationship, not least with Brunei, underlined by your recently published economic blueprint and economic diversification agenda. August brought the first ever ASEAN Economic Ministers Dialogue with the UK, which Dato and I attended alongside my colleague, the International Trade Secretary, Liz Truss. In October, we saw the first UK dialogue with the ASEAN Secretary General regarding the Master Plan on ASEAN Connectivity 2025. In November, the UK was heavily involved in the ASEAN Business and Investment Summit, and it was a pleasure to address that. And in September, I visited Vietnam. In December, Liz Truss visited Singapore and Vietnam securing transition free trade agreements with both countries. This year will, I hope, see even greater UK engagement with ASEAN, including supporting Brunei with its priorities as chair. We envisage a second UK-ASEAN economic dialogue, engagement at the ASEAN Economic Ministers meeting, a second ASEAN-UK Business Forum, and significant presence at the ASEAN Business and Investment Summit. We will continue to support supply chain resilience across ASEAN, including through the UK Accelerated COVID-19 Economic Support Programme and research with the Economic Research Institute of ASEAN and East Asia. And of course, we aim to apply for formal accession to the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, or sometimes known as the TPP-11. The UK's accession to this huge free trade area of 11 dynamic economies, including, I think, 4 in ASEAN, including Brunei, is a top priority for us and a key part of our trade negotiations programme. We aim to make a formal notification of our intent to accede early this year. This will complement the bilateral FTAs we are negotiating with CPTPP members and underlines our strong commitment to Asia Pacific and the opportunities it holds for greater trade and investment. And I'm very pleased that Brunei is committed to ratifying CPTPP and grateful for your ongoing support for our UK accession to it. This is all part of the UK's renewed focus on Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia as we look to the possibilities of the wider world. And in ASEAN, that potential is clearly remarkable. And that is why also the UK is applying for ASEAN Dialogue Partner status as well. From our first-class financial institutions to our engineers, architects and designers, to our education providers, to our diplomatic network, one of the most extensive of any European country, the UK attaches great importance to Asia Pacific generally and the ASEAN markets specifically. Linking UK innovation and expertise with the vibrancy, dynamism and immense business opportunities of ASEAN countries can bring growth opportunities for both Asia Pacific and UK businesses alike. So finally, Dato, Baroness Neville-Rolfe, if I may, with the help of institutions like the UK-ASEAN Business Council, we are determined to achieve just that. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Minister, thank you so much for your clarity and for your ambition. One final question. What is your top priority as Trade Policy Minister this year?
Well, thank you, Lucy. We've got a lot of priorities. As you can imagine, this year is the first year that the UK has an independent trade policy since 1973. So that there's a lot of things we've been wanting to do. So my priorities are increased UK business to businesses to trade across the world. There's no point negotiating trade agreements or trade policy or market access agreements if we're not doing it on behalf of UK businesses and UK consumers. And that is very, very important, the connection with the business community. We are here to serve businesses and consumers. We've also got now control over our own laws and our own trade. We're currently negotiating free trade agreements with the United States, with Australia, with New Zealand, and right at the center of our activity this year is our application to join CPTPP. I mentioned also in terms of beyond trade, our application for dialogue partner status at ASEAN is a big priority for this year as well. So I would say that is quite a lot going on. We've also got trade dialogues, bilateral trade dialogues with Thailand, Indonesia and Malaysia. And I'm also looking forward to hosting our Joint Economic and Trade Committee with Vietnam this year as well. So we have some very important bilateral engagement in the ASEAN region, as well as with ASEAN itself, and as well as, of course, with our great friends in Brunei as well.
So thank you. An unprecedented degree of priority, if I might comment.
There's quite a lot in there. Yes.
On the area, which is completely marvellous. Can I take the opportunity to thank both of you ministers for your keynote addresses? They set us off really well for the panel discussion on ASEAN's economic outlook in 2021. what we need to do to prepare for that. And I'm now going to move on to that with many, many thanks. We have a great lineup of speakers, and in the interest of time, I will introduce them as they speak. But most importantly, we'd very much like to hear from our audience. So please can you send in your questions via the Q&A box. Our first speaker is Dr. Elms. Dr. Elms, thank you so much for joining us from Singapore. You are founder and executive director of the Asia Trade Centre. You work closely with government and business in the region on trade, and we look forward to hearing your view of the key issues for the year ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm pleased to be able to join such a great panel, including following in the wake of ministers. So I think that's fantastic. And I think one of the things that you heard from both of the keynote speeches was the level of general enthusiasm for ASEAN, the ASEAN agenda, for Brunei's chairmanship, et cetera, and for a really long list of agenda items, priority items that ASEAN has, that the UK has, and that the rest of the world is likely to have. And so what I was asked to do, though, before we get down even more into Brunei's chairmanship objectives and ASEAN's own integration story, I was asked to sort of zoom out for just a moment, because whatever ASEAN would like to accomplish also has to take into account the broader system and the broader forces that are active in the region. COVID, of course, is going to drive policy in 2021, I'm sad to say, for all of us. But beyond COVID, there are a number of other challenges or a number of other opportunities that I think are worth highlighting early as we think about how Brunei can more effectively shape its chair year and get the kinds of high quality outcomes that it's looking for ASEAN as a whole. And before I get into that, let me just also say I'm delighted that we are working with the ASEAN countries to help with a couple of the priority items for Brunei, including identification of non-tariff measures and the implementation of the e-commerce agreement. These are two projects that we are running here out of Singapore. Delighted to be working with ASEAN on those. So in the context of trying to think about how ASEAN can more effectively become integrated and achieve its own objectives, it's important to remember that we are in a very unsettled landscape more broadly. And it's not just because of COVID, although COVID, of course, like everything else, accelerates and magnifies some of the challenges that were underway beforehand. But I would note that ASEAN is trying to operate in an unsettled trade landscape at the global level, where we've had World Trade Organization, WTO, discussions that have been really made more and more difficult over the last few years. Now, it's very easy to blame the outgoing US administration of Donald Trump for stopping WTO objectives. But I think it's important to realize that many of the challenges at the global system predate Trump's arrival and will continue after he leaves office tomorrow. And so one of the things that ASEAN will have to think about is how can it provide a platform or a discussion or an example of continuing integration when the global system has been really hamstrung by a variety of challenges. I think that's something that's worth thinking about and worth reflecting on, how ASEAN and the WTO itself can work together, because we need to have those global trade rules in effect. And this is especially key for businesses. Global businesses like from the UK, like from Brunei and across ASEAN, need to rely on international rules of trade to help govern the situation, or the risk and uncertainty will continue into the future. So we have a disrupted global system. I think that's a challenge. Hopefully the election of US President Biden tomorrow will help bring some less chaos. I can't say that it will bring about a resolution of all things, but at least less chaos. And I think that's very helpful. And I know many people are looking forward to tomorrow's inauguration with great anticipation, and the expectations that the US will return to its traditional role in setting policy on a whole host of things, not the least of which is trade, I think is useful, but probably overblown, because there's only so much that the Biden administration will be able to do. And we will continue as a result to have some significant tensions that are underway in 2021 between some of the major players. So that includes the US, the Europeans, and the Chinese. And so how we resolve that, I think, is worth paying attention to, especially if ASEAN wants to achieve its broader objectives. part of what matters to a region like ASEAN is what happens to its important trading partners. And many of those important trading partners, not the least of which, of course, the Americans and the Chinese, are still in a evolving and rapidly changing set of relationships with one another. So ASEAN will have to continue to navigate carefully between American and Chinese objectives and American and Chinese demands of ASEAN, even though ASEAN itself, of course, would always prefer to have maximum room for flexibility and be able to do whatever is in the interest of ASEAN and its member states. I think it still presents a challenge for the region with a few opportunities. And one opportunity that I would highlight that was mentioned earlier that fits with ASEAN's objective is the potential for collaboration around climate and sustainability issues. That's an area where the UK also, I think, is going to play some important role. So there are some areas of integration, collaboration, and places where ASEAN and ASEAN member states can usefully and more effectively plug into global arguments. And there are some areas where tensions will continue. And so I think it's worth remembering that while we talk a lot in ASEAN about the importance of supply chains, those supply chains typically do not supply just ASEAN, but they supply larger markets outside of the region and across the region. And so paying attention to these tensions and the opportunities that COVID has presented, although it feels like all downside and no upside. One upside to COVID, I think, is it highlights the importance of integration, which is something that it's a story that I think ASEAN tells well. It's a story that resonates outside of the region. And the more that ASEAN can effectively integrate to address challenges like movement of medical supplies, equipment, the important role for digital trade and digital connectivity, digital services, the crucial role for small businesses in empowering global and regional growth. Those are stories that I think ASEAN can highlight and can help drive the conversations outside of the region. So I think I'll stop there, but what I wanted to do before we moved on into more ASEAN discussions is remind everyone of the context in which this region operates, where there are both opportunities and challenges ahead. And I think it's important to remember that whatever goals you might have often collide with reality in a hurry. And this situation that we enter in 2021 is challenging. So I'm actually very pleased that the government of Brunei has taken over the chairmanship of ASEAN, because I think it has the ability to navigate these uncertain waters more effectively than maybe some of the other ASEAN partners might be able to, and might be able to, in this case, punch above its weight and deliver some concrete objective outcomes for the region, which it badly needs. So thank you very much.
Deborah, thank you so much for that. And as you see, we've already had evidence today of Brunei punching above its weight. I will move on, if I may, to our next panelist, Mark Garnier MP, who's the Prime Minister's trade envoy in the UK to Brunei, to Myanmar and to Thailand, a former banker in the City of London, and indeed a former minister. We travelled together in those days. And would ask him to talk to us about how we might contribute to Brunei's economic priorities. Mark, welcome, and over to you.
Well, Lucy, thank you very much indeed. I hope I'm unmuted.
You are.
Fantastic, thank you. It's one of the challenges of giving speeches in this 21st century world. Look, first of all, it's a great pleasure to be invited to come along and do this forum. I think it's one of my first fora appearances since I've taken over this role again of being the Prime Minister's trade envoy to the region. It was a role I had before being a minister and had a brief sojourn on the backbenches. But what I really wanted to look at was really how Britain relates to ASEAN, and particularly in the year ahead and beyond. And I think we've heard from Minister Greg Hands a little bit about Britain's ambitions, but I think we face a very challenging year ahead, because I think for the first time now, as Minister Hands says, since 1973, we can now control our own trade policy. But a couple of years ago, I was doing some work looking at the global Britain policy and how we were going to deliver ourselves to the rest of the world. And one of the most overriding messages that was coming back from the rest of the world was that there was a great deal of affection for Britain, but everybody was very confused about what was going on. And if you remember, we had very, very difficult time in politics as we were negotiating the withdrawal agreement with the European Union. And this is a country that, the Commonwealth, for example, had been respecting for many years, that was now having its own sort of paroxysms of anguish in terms of trying to secure our EU withdrawal. We've now achieved it. And I suspect that the rest of the world is now looking to Britain to see what we're going to do with this opportunity. How are we going to take advantage of this true global Britain? And how we relate with these big organizations around the world is incredibly important. And Greg Hans has already talked about how we want to try to help reform the World Trade Organization. In particular, I'd like to see some more work done in trade in services and trade in data, because obviously those types of things are still yet to be really defined. We completely understand trade in goods, but data and services are a little bit more esoteric. Similarly, the US-China trade wars, this is something which ultimately we need to help resolve, and the WTO is the obvious place to do that. But as everybody knows, when elephants fight, the grass gets trampled, and this is something we need to resolve. When it comes to an organization like ASEAN and the Pacific in general, this is clearly an area of astonishing economic growth. I spent my time as an investment banker as an Asian specialist back in the 1980s and 1990s. Back then we were regarding even quite sophisticated markets now as emerging markets. I look at places like Thailand and Hong Kong, China, all the rest of them as emerged markets. These are well-developed opportunities. And just in the last 10 years or so, we've seen a pickup of trade to ASEAN, the UK and ASEAN, by 50%, which is no mean feat. So what we need to do is to continue to engage more with ASEAN, and our application to be a dialogue partner, for example, is one of those really important measures, which is an advance forward, although I do obviously completely understand that we did have dialogue partnership as a member of the European Union, and to a certain extent we have to take our place in the queue. But nonetheless, this is, we recognize ASEAN as an incredibly important bloc which we need to engage with. And if the rate of growth continues for the next 20 or 30 years, ASEAN will be the biggest economic trading bloc on the world. So how can a country like Britain not engage with ASEAN? And indeed, as Minister Hans said, we're looking at a tilt in our approach to the rest of the world in terms of trade towards the Asia-Pacific rim, because that is where the global growth is going to come from. So engaging with ASEAN and seeking ascension to CPTPP is incredibly important. And I think when you look at how we get along with ASEAN countries, I think that really illustrates how we are proposing to sort of conduct ourselves. We have dialogue partnerships with Thailand, with Indonesia, with Malaysia. Thailand one is about to come to its conclusion, and that should end up with a JETCO thereafter. We've got trade deals, rollover trade deals with Vietnam and Singapore, and yet we need to do more trade deals across the world. And again, as Greg said, we're looking to cover 80% of the world in terms of our total trade within, I think, it's the next 3 years. So there's a huge opportunity. I am very excited about global Britain. I was a Remainer during the referendum, but I do see we have a fantastic opportunity. And all of us who were Remainers need to get behind the concept of losers' consent and really get behind the global Britain opportunity. So my role as a trade envoy to 3 of the ASEAN countries is all about getting deep into the weeds in order to make sure that we do generate greater trade. But I work with 2 other trade envoys, Richard Graham and Heather Wheeler. And between the 3 of us, we cover the 10 ASEAN countries, and Richard Graham is the Prime Minister Trade Envoy to ASEAN itself. So we have a great opportunity to develop relationships both with the individual nations and with the wider ASEAN group, and indeed with the whole of the Indo-Pacific region. Lucy, back to you.
Mark, thank you so much. And it's so great to have your experience and energy on this whole area of ASEAN, which is obviously going to be very exciting this year, actually, for the next 5 years. Our next speaker is Dr. Rizal Sukma. He's a very good friend of the UK-ASEAN Business Council, as he was until recently a very successful ambassador of Indonesia in London. He's back in Jakarta. He's now a senior researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and is widely regarded as one of the top thought leaders in the region. Over to you, Dr. Rizal, and perhaps I could ask the final two speakers to keep their comments brief so we have some time for questions. Over to you.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank the UKABC, for inviting me to join this webinar. So I think it's quite, important, because for 2021, ASEAN will face two biggest challenges. The first one is, of course, the challenge of, how to acquire and then distribute and then execute the vaccinations across, the ASEAN member state. So that is, I think is huge task, for countries like Indonesia, and also, of course, the other, countries with a large population such as Vietnam. So in Indonesia, for example, at least, we need 500 million, dose, of the vaccine, in order to address this COVID-19. And within that context, I think, we've been pushing for ASEAN, to really strengthen its collective efforts, to address this problem. The second challenge is actually on how to really revive the economy. I think this is the biggest impact of the COVID-19 on the economy. So I think here the Brunei focus on recovery and also on the digitalization, I think provide the foundation for that collective efforts of ASEAN. So for the whole year this year, I think these two issues will dominate ASEAN member state. And of course, because these two challenges are so difficult, so most ASEAN member states, I think, do not like to see these priorities, which is addressing the COVID-19 and also the economic recovery, to be complicated by the growing rivalry between the US and China. So here, I think we really want to appeal to both the US and China not to define its relationship with ASEAN in terms of its rivalry with each other. So I think we need to focus the attention from how to use ASEAN as the ground for rivalry into more productive cooperations. So within within that context again, so I think we really want to see a greater engagement of post-Trump United States in economic activities in the region. So I think like the minister mentioned also earlier, all other actors I think will be welcome in Southeast Asia, and especially through the economic and development engagement with ASEAN, including of course the UK, who has been I think a very strong footprint in Southeast Asia region. So I think I just stop there. Thank you so much.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed. And yet another challenge for us. Thank you for giving it to us. Our final panelist is in the economic and business area. It is Joseph Incalcatira. He is chief economist for ASEAN for HSBC, one of the UKABC's valued partners. Joseph is based in Hong Kong. He covers the region, and he very much has his finger on the pulse of Southeast Asia. And the questions are coming in thick and fast, but it's probably your last chance to enter a question if you want one. But meanwhile, Joseph, can I ask you to share some introductory remarks?
Thank you for the introduction, and hello everybody. I'm very happy to join today. So I'd like to share a little bit of comments on the scope of the recovery in ASEAN. As we've discussed on the call, the outlook in the short term is quite challenging for Southeast Asia. Both the breadth of the spread of the disease and perhaps somewhat delayed vaccination programs compared maybe to developed markets will definitely weigh on the short-term recovery. But we would argue that once the virus is brought under control, there's a very tangible scope for Southeast Asia, for ASEAN, to outperform not only emerging markets, but the broader region. And the reason has to do with the investment outlook. So one comment is about FDI and the investment actually that's been occurring over the last year. So like we've heard earlier, there's been a massive shock to global trade, depressed business activity across the world. But interestingly, throughout the pandemic, ASEAN has actually been gaining global market share in terms of foreign direct investment. Now, many would recall that even before COVID-19, around the time of the US-China trade war, there was all this talk of supply chain relocation to Southeast Asia. And indeed, we did see very strong inward FDI numbers. But we would argue that that trend was already starting quite a few years before that, around 2012, 2013, rising labor costs in China, a desire by some producers, particularly Korean and Japanese, to diversify away from China, actually laid the seeds, planted the seeds for that FDI boom. And it sustained into 2020. So even though massive uncertainty around the world, companies were basically saying that Southeast Asia is the correct business environment as a manufacturing base for the future economy. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that there was a very important head start in key industries. So for example, in the electronics field, we've continued to see new FDI capacity, especially in places like Singapore, Malaysia, but also Vietnam. And that's not just electronics assembly, it's increasingly more higher value added semiconductor production. So for example, we tend to think of Taiwan or South Korea as the key semiconductor producers for memory chips, but actually roughly 40% of global exports of processor and controller chips actually come from Southeast Asia. And if you look at recent news headlines with chronic supply issues in the semiconductor space, the fact that with 5G adoption, with chips embedded in everything, this is clearly an industry of the future, and Southeast Asia retains a very strong competitive edge here. And again, we continue to see further market share gains. Of course, there is some competition from China as China builds its own chip industry, but we think that particularly with Western, with US, European, Japanese producers, ASEAN is the area of choice. So we're very constructive there. We also think in the commodity upgrading cycle, that's also very important, particularly in Indonesia, Malaysia, and I would argue Brunei as well. We see efforts to essentially move more into downstream or higher value added commodity related sectors. And one area I'd like to highlight is in Indonesia, where there's been this massive nickel boom of nickel smelter capacity to not only allow the country to process its nickel onshore, but eventually become a key player in the global electric vehicle battery supply chain. And as we've seen with Tesla and massive investment from EV producers, if Southeast Asia, both Indonesia, but also Philippines, utilize their nickel reserves, it's almost undoubtedly the region will become a key node of production there. So overall, we see actually ASEAN's FDI share going from around 10% pre-COVID to up to 15% of global FDI inflows in the last few years. Now, I'd like to quickly also talk about the public investment and infrastructure cycle. This was historically a very important driver of growth in ASEAN, especially in the last few years. And actually, when we look at fiscal plans from governments for 2021, 2022, it looks like they're keeping very strong focus on infrastructure financing as a way to drive the recovery after COVID. And ASEAN did quite a big job on a regional level, like kind of creating or individuating key projects that will help improve the region's connectivity. And we think that construction proceeds quite quickly. So in the US, in the Eurozone, perhaps in the UK, China, sometimes infrastructure financing is more of a question mark as a potential recovery area. We would argue that in ASEAN, these already is going to be happening. Lastly, there's increasing room to incorporate climate change goals into these infrastructure plans. And one encouraging side effect of the crisis is that, especially in countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, Philippines, there's been a massive rethink about electricity derived from coal, given the lack of demand this year. And hopefully that spurs a new round of climate change investment, particularly with renewed US leadership in the area. I'll stop here and look forward to any questions.
Joseph, that was great and gave us the sort of broader economic picture. Thank you for that. The first question I'm going to take is from Tan Sri Munir of the ASEAN BAC for Malaysia. And I'd like to refer that to Deborah. How does she think ASEAN should build on the MOU on NTMs that was signed off last November? It is, of course, one of Brunei's priority economic deliverables. And at ASEAN BAC, his organization, our view is that we would have preferred a binding agreement rather than just an MOU, as well as greater transparency. Deborah.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have this question. We've been working on non-tariff measures at the Asian Trade Center now for a couple of years. We did a report with the EU-ASEAN Business Council in particular and ASEAN BAC to look into NTMs. And we did a series of interviews with companies across the region in 3 specific sectors to say, what are the challenges that you face? How many of them are non-tariff measures or barriers? We didn't get into an argument over which was which, but just to identify that they exist, where they exist. And now we're working on a sort of a continuation of that project to help build a toolkit for officials to create, or at least to limit non-tariff measures before they get started. So to be able to identify what might end up being a non-tariff restriction on trade before you implement it at the domestic level, then we might have fewer of them to get rid of later. But what I would say is the challenge, and this gets to the question about how we negotiate them. I am less fussed personally about whether you make them an MOU, you make it a framework agreement, you make it a Pathfinder initiative. I don't care what you call it, as long as you have the commitment and you implement it. So ASEAN is very big on developing all kinds of different approaches, tools, agreements. They are less good at implementation. And so I think the key for me on NTMs, and the only way we're actually going to address them, because we have lots of commitments in lots of formats to reduce NTMs and eliminate NTBs. This has been going on for a long time in ASEAN. Key now is, are we serious about doing something? So I don't care whether you negotiate an MOU or you put it in a trade deal or what, let's implement it. So I would love to see ASEAN, and I'm happy that Brunei put that first, to actually commit to reducing those non-tariff issues, because they are the biggest impediment to trade in the region. And they've kept, in part, ASEAN trade stuck at less than 25%, no matter what's happened with the tariff levels in the region. So I think it's really past time to address some of these NTMs.
Thank you for that. I'm going to keep the questions coming because we've got lots. The next is from Mo Kua, the ASEAN BAC in Myanmar. Mark, I think we might give you this question. The UK was seen as a gateway to Europe for Myanmar products. Now you've left the EU, does this strategic advantage still stand?
And there lies the, what is it, 150 billion pound question, I think, which is it's an incredibly important question. So one of the interesting things the UK or positions the UK has held, has been the biggest destination for foreign direct investment into the European Union for many years now. And what is interesting is, even in the last 2 or 3 years where we've been negotiating to come out of the European Union, we've still been the biggest destination for foreign direct investment into the European Union. 28, of course, it's now the 27. So this year, of course, is the first year we're going to be able to see exactly what happens. But I think there are a number of different reasons why people come to the UK, and there's absolutely no shadow of a doubt that the market access to the rest of the EU has always been part of it. But it's also our legal system, it's also our language, it's also our education. It's a number of, generally speaking, political predictability, the safety of your assets. Our law protects your assets in terms of property and all the rest of it. And what that has meant is that if you're seeking to get access to the single market, you will come to the UK and base yourself there. And that obviously includes financial services institutions for the City of London. Key to this is, the question of, will Nissan or Honda or Toyota or any of these international car manufacturers, by way of example, stay within the EU to continue to sell to the EU? And the answer seems to be absolutely yes. What we have now is a trade deal where there are no tariffs on goods between and indeed services between the EU and the UK. So there is no economic cost in terms of your price being pushed up as a result of the trade deal we've done. However, I think there are certain issues to do with red tape and to do with stickiness at the borders. And we're now seeing a little bit of stickiness at the borders over things like food products. So we've seen fishery products, meat products have got stuck in the port. There's a lot of, I suppose it's growing pains in terms of how the relationship works. But my guess, as I say, having been skeptical about leaving the European Union, my guess is that we will probably continue to be the biggest area of destination of foreign direct investment from the rest of the world for multiple reasons, not just market access, but because we've got those zero tariffs. there will still be market access. Where I do have concern, though, is for financial services, because we are relying on the equivalence regime. But otherwise, with goods, I think it'll be fine.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Although, obviously, the problems on financial services may be an opportunity for the ASEAN links on financial services and fintech, on which we previously had some seminars. Moving on, I've got a couple of questions I'm going to take together on digital and education. And I'll come first to you, Joseph, on this. So Paul from Cambridge Education Group, I would like to ask what the ASEAN region's perspective is on online learning during the time of restricted travel. The Minister mentioned digital transformation, and we run an MSc in this through Hull University. Any thoughts on the future of UK education exports during the coming year? And then Kagila Balakrishnan, the University of Warwick. I was rather interested in the idea of ASEAN integration and the effectiveness of the intra-ASEAN trade. Again, as digital trade is becoming increasingly vital in this context to facilitate trade, does the panel feel that ASEAN is well connected digitally and has paid sufficient attention to enhancing the effectiveness of digital business and digital security? So Joseph, education and digital, some thoughts, and then perhaps Deborah would like to come in.
Sure, I'll start first with the digital trade, and I think this also ties into the argument about non-tariff barriers. But for sure, there is more scope for ASEAN to improve integration on this front. We know the region has some of the world's largest tech unicorns, in particular those that are originating from Indonesia. And while they have branched out to the region, other parts of the region, this perhaps haven't happened as quickly as many were hoping for. So I know ASEAN does have an e-commerce framework that they launched a few years ago, and it does seem like there has been tangible progress in creating kind of an overlying series of standards for that. But I think I would hope to see more integration on that front. That could be one area where if ASEAN integrates in 2021, that could really pay dividends in the coming years. As for education, I'm not the biggest expert on digital education per se, but I know this was actually a reform area in a few countries, in particular in Indonesia. I believe the parliament was actually looking at a debate to liberalize foreign education providers from coming in and setting up universities. So this is something that policymakers are thinking about. And I would argue that, if you look at ASEAN's trend recently, a lot of it has been driving FDI into the region to have investment and economic growth. There is scope, however, for more indigenous talent and for more indigenous companies to grow. And I think the one perhaps area where there needs to be more domestic reform is improving financing that goes to higher education in the region. So this is one area where in pockets of ASEAN, there's a bit of underperformance if you look at PISA results, for example, or other benchmarks. So I think education reform is something that on the local level in particular, really needs to be accelerated.
Thank you. Deborah?
So digital should be the future. It's clearly, if COVID has taught us anything, it's that online matters. And so ASEAN has a mixed track record there. On the one hand, they have incredibly digital savvy companies and consumers. Mobile phone applications are through the roof. We have lots of great companies who are delivering goods and services online. That's fantastic. The regulatory landscape is behind, as always, in this fast-moving tech space, is behind where businesses actually are. But what I would say ASEAN has been doing very well is it's been trying to tackle many of these regulatory issues to try to create common types of policies in the region. And I would point to a few things. First, the e-commerce agreement, which is moving towards implementation, but also a number of challenges around the digital and data flows and trying to think about policies that make sense at the ASEAN level for managing data flows. We should see something, I think, in 2021 about what ASEAN intends to do about that. They've got a digital economy ministers meeting, which I think is extremely helpful. And so there's a lot of regulatory action taking place inside of ASEAN to help empower and accelerate digital trade. However, again, we're still waiting for some of those policies which are lagging behind business to catch up with where business is at, and then again to be implemented. So it's taken us several years to get the e-commerce agreement implemented. I hope the same thing doesn't happen with the digital trade flows and the data rules that are coming for ASEAN. I hope that if those come out and they're useful, they get implemented quite quickly, because businesses need this. And we see here in ASEAN, with our small businesses especially, that digital can mean the difference between surviving and failing. And better policies to help them survive, I think, is in the interest of everyone in ASEAN. So I'm delighted that digital's on the agenda. It's very important. It should be thought of as connective tissue rather than a separate sector. And I think ASEAN has plenty of ground to cover, but nearly every government, frankly, is behind where business is in the digital space.
I think connective tissue, digital as connective tissue, is a great comment. Thank you. I'm now going to move on. I got a question from my friend, the Thai ambassador to London, Ambassador Pisanu. And I'm going to, I think, come to Mark and to Dr. Rizal on this. How do you see the prospect of political development in the US and its impact upon the UK on the independent trade policy of the UK? Mark, first.
Well, I think we're going to enter a period of normalcy, I think, in America. It's going to be, I think anybody who's been following American politics, and there aren't too many people who would have missed what's going on in America, would have seen that we've gone through 4 years of very peculiar politics, and there's going to be an awful lot written about what's been going on in America over the last 4 years. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, when you start seeing these big giants like America battling with China, everybody gets hurt as the elephants beat each other up and trample on the ground around them. Look, Biden is a very experienced politician and somebody who understands how the world works. I think what we are likely to come to is a period where we have a lot of peace and bridge building again between America and the rest of the world. America has turned in on itself, and I think that's been a real problem. The Western world certainly has looked to America for a great deal of stability and a great deal of influence in terms of what happens elsewhere. And it's just been lacking. Although bizarrely, I keep saying this about Donald Trump, of course, bizarrely, he has been the first American president to talk to Kim Jong-un. So it's not completely without achievement. Look, I'm very optimistic about the future in terms of how America engages. I think we will start to see things resolve themselves. We'll start to see a direction of travel with, for example, in the WTO. We need to see America engaging with that again. So I am optimistic, but you know, I'm very interested to hear what other people have got to say about it.
Thank you. And Dr. Rizal?
Let me answer the questions on education as well. I just want to say that there's a huge opportunity, like Joseph just mentioned, because now it's possible for the foreign university to open in Indonesia, and in fact, Monash University has been the first, to open their campus. They started late last year, so I think we will welcome more university from the UK to also come to Indonesia. On the impact of the US on Britain, like Mr. Mark Garnier has mentioned. So I think since now UK wants to play an independent role, so we of course from the region expect that the UK to be more independent of the US. Thank you.
Well, while you've got the floor, can I ask you a question I've been wanting to ask you, which is about the vaccine, because the state of the region is heavily dependent on the rollout of the vaccine in ASEAN, as everywhere. Do you have a feel as to when enough people will be vaccinated to allow ASEAN trade and development and engagement to start again properly? And what's the situation in Indonesia?
Well, the challenge, of course, in Indonesia. So by the end of this year, we hope that we'll be able to vaccinate around like 128 million Indonesians. So that hopefully will really help ease all the restrictions that we already have. But of course, the challenge is really how to provide and get access to those vaccine. Even though of course on paper we already secure around like 500 million dose with all the main producers of vaccine, including the AstraZeneca. But in doing it, I think because Indonesia is also there are a lot of remote areas that we need to get into in order to do this provide vaccine to all the the people. So hopefully by the end of the year the majority of Indonesia will get vaccinated. and then we can, really see the beginning of the economic recovery as well.
Thank you. We've got a question, I think, for Deborah, which is about the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. From Carl Hunter is interested in this because of the potential for his company. And obviously the UK is very keen to accede to this, as we heard from our minister. But how can UK companies operating in Southeast Asia benefit from this agreement? And is there a win-win, Deborah?
There is absolutely a win-win. So we are, and I'm delighted to welcome anyone's interest in the CPTPP. This is the most useful agreement for companies that's been signed, certainly in this region. I have made this challenge many times, and so far I haven't lost the bet. If you come to us as a company, we will find you money or we will save you costs. But either way, we can promise that out of CPTPP, which we cannot do with any other trade agreement, and certainly not in this part of the world. So CPTPP, very helpful. We are already in year 4 of tariff cuts between the active members. So what needs to happen now is firms need to be paying more close attention to how to use it, because it gives you competitive advantage in the CPTPP markets. That's very helpful. Second, we need to make sure that Brunei, I'm looking at you, Brunei and Malaysia get themselves through the process so that they're actually taking part. Both of them have negotiated schedules. They've got all the commitments in there. We're waiting for domestic level ratification to take place so that companies that are based in Brunei and Malaysia can join Singapore and Vietnam in ASEAN as part of the CPTPP. And then third, we need the expansion of CPTPP to take place this year. And I'm delighted that the UK is going to be moving forward with accession. Not only is that useful for CPTPP and helpful for the UK, but it also is helping spur interest from other new members in joining CPTPP, including Korea, which has gotten much more serious in the last couple of weeks around joining and potentially joining alongside the UK. The Philippines has announced that it will relook at this. Thailand's interest, which has been off again, on again, seems to be back on again. And so there's a whole lot of renewed enthusiasm around CPTPP. And for companies, the bigger the CPTPP gets, the better it is for you. So companies should also be advocating to their governments to make sure that they either activate the agreement or get into the agreement to the extent that they can, because the benefits of being in are significant for firms. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I've got 1 or 2 specific questions for Brunei, which I think we may want to pass on to them. But I'd like to take a final question on energy, and then I'll come back to each of the panel to ask them, as it were, for their thoughts about what we want to achieve at the year ahead. But this is a question from Peter Godfrey. Further to the opening remarks, one of the biggest regional development issues is the development of a coherent and stable policy framework for sustainability and energy transition. Do you believe there's any prospect, given Brunei's position, for more integrated energy development strategy? I suppose both across Brunei, but perhaps you could widen the answer if you would. I'll come to Joseph first. And then there's a question linked, I think, because energy and sustainability are sort of the future. Question from Namit Agarwal. What are your thoughts on the implementation of the ASEAN Sustainable Banking Guidelines after the pandemic? So Joseph, would you like to pick up on those energy questions, and and in fact, if you've got any particular priorities for the year ahead, perhaps you could let us have those, and then I will go back to the other members of the panel.
Sure. I guess from my perspective, as energy relates to climate change, if you were to look at the top 10 cities in the world that are most susceptible to rising sea levels, which is a threat even in the short term, not just long term, actually 4 of them are in Southeast Asia. So Southeast Asia really doesn't even have the option of ignoring climate change, because the threat is real. Anybody that lives in North Jakarta will see the flooding sea levels that happens quite regularly. Same thing in parts of Manila. Bangkok, southern Vietnam, all are in flood areas. So kind of changing the carbon intensity of the energy mix should be a very strong priority in the short term. Now, the bad news is that in the last few years, the share of coal in the energy mix has risen quite sharply. And part of that was unavoidable. Parts of the region needed to develop. It was simply not only the cheapest energy, but perhaps the only feasible one. But the comforting news is that the economics of clean energy has changed drastically just in the last few years, as the cost of solar decreases significantly every year due to new technologies. Indonesia sits on some of the largest geothermal energy reserves in the world. So the resources are there, the opportunities are there. I just think that, you know, Southeast Asia would really benefit from a more global approach to the topic. For example, more talk about carbon taxes or more support from multilateral agencies specifically for climate change, because the region has the interest in moving forward with this, but just might need a little bit more of a concerted global effort. So I think regional policymakers understand the threats of climate change. It just needs to be more of a multilateral issue. So that would be my main topic, my main response to that question.
And Dr. Rizal, any thoughts, you know, as for priorities for 2021 as we close?
As I mentioned earlier, you know, I think the ASEAN unity is really tested, you know, in 2021, because, you know, the ability to work together to address the two challenges that I mentioned, you know, the COVID-19 and also the economic recovery, where, you know, will present, you know, a serious challenge, you know, for ASEAN cooperation, you know, because, you know, we learned once, you know, the COVID become, you know, almost out of control, everybody actually, you know, went their own way in order to secure, you know, their interests. So now it's time actually to get back together under the Brunei chairmanships in 2021.
Thank you. Deborah?
I'm going to give the piece of unpopular advice I gave Thailand 2 years ago, which they ignored, but I'll give it anyways. I think it would be great if ASEAN would have no agenda for the year, as in no new items to be added to the agenda. And the reason for that is that ASEAN has an incredibly packed agenda with commitments, promises, pledges, work plans, action plans, projects, etc., in almost any topic you want to think of already. So rather than make new ones, why don't we try very hard at the ASEAN level to implement some of the existing commitments rather than make yet another declaration and another whatever. Now, I know it's unpopular because that's not how ministers get their photo in the paper. Apologies to our ministers on the line, but it is important to actually deliver results, which is what business, who's mostly on this line, I think, wants. They don't want more pictures in the paper. They actually want implementation of concrete objectives. And I would like it if ASEAN could really knuckle down and deliver concrete results from all of its past commitments. Otherwise, you don't get the integration that the ambassador is discussing. Thanks.
Thank you for that challenge. Mark?
Thank you, Lucy. I mean, I think when any country looks at its international position in the world, there are really sort of 4 or 5 key things that a country has to look at. And those are obviously trade, which we've talked a lot about this morning, but also the other areas of aid and international development. We need to look at our diplomacy and foreign policy. And then, of course, defense policy. And of course, in the case of a country like Britain, all of that is wrapped up in this esoteric idea of soft power. I think, as I've started, we're at a very important pivotal point for the United Kingdom as we leave the European Union and come out and demonstrate what values we have that we can share with the rest of the world. When it comes to our relationship with parts of the world, we need to have a 21st century view on all of this and recognize that these countries have come a long way since we were last engaging with them, if you like, directly back in 1973. And I think that we need to offer ourselves in order to be able to help in terms of things like how to, as Deborah was saying, how to implement policies within an organization like ASEAN. We can help with that. But equally so, at the same time, we need to get out of the way if we are hindering organizations like this. And so my view is the biggest challenge for us with ASEAN is to make sure that we are seen as a really helpful partner, really enthusiastic advocate of ASEAN, and to do whatever we can to make it a great success.
Mark, thank you so much. And I mean, just in summing up, I'd say I think we've heard today clearly from Dato Dr. Amin about the 10 priority economic deliverables, and we will support him in trying to deliver those. We heard from Greg Hans about the UK's new trade agenda and the ambitions for CCTP, dialogue status, and of course, bilateral relations right across the region and the strengthened effort. And I think we heard from everybody about the opportunities actually of things that are outlined by Dr. Amin: climate, sustainability, digital, but also supply chains, you know, the traditional, more traditional sector, particularly post-pandemic, and of course, infrastructure. And it was very good to hear, I thought, from Joseph, that infrastructure is going ahead and that will be a driver of growth in economics, because for businesses operating in this area, my members, we are very keen that Southeast Asia should flourish and that we should flourish with it. On which note, I think I'd just like to close thanking the Honourable Yanti Rahman and the Asian Business Council, obviously the UK-ASEAN Business Council, and Ian and Alan and Veronica for all their work, the Brunei High Commissioner, our two ministers, Dato Dr. Min Lu and Greg Hans, our distinguished panel, who I won't thank individually again, but you've done an amazing job. And thank you to the audience for bearing with us and for your brilliant questions. This concludes the forum. Thank you very much indeed.